have set this up, and we have some lovely white noise in the background, courtesy of my daughter's bedroom. The joys of the time that we have here in the COVID years. I think this should all be working. I have tried to set it up um, so that it is now working through various channels. So I think it should be set up correctly. Um, we shall see if anyone finds it. Not 100% sure it will work. I know it's working on my side. Um, but I decided I wanted to read tonight a little bit from sort of the first third, about a third of the way in from Queen of None. So this is the book that I'm reading from today. That's one of the reasons that I'm doing this, is that today, this week, is actually the 1 year anniversary of the release of this book, and I just recently finished the sequel, and the main character in that sequel is Huifar, who is first introduced in this chapter, which is chapter 6, called Frayed Ends, which is one of many fabric jokes that I make throughout, puns that I make throughout this book. But I thought I would start with a little bit of that introduction to refresh people's minds when hopefully the second book comes out next year in 2022. So join me for a little fireside conversation. And this is through the voice of Anna Pendragon. And she is, for those who may not know, the sister of Arthur Pendragon. And she is describing the sister of Guinevere named Huifar of Avilion, and her impression as she is forced to meet her in order to get something that she wants, and from her brother. The famed Huifa of Avilion missed the birth of her nephew, but eventually arrived after harvest festivities with a troupe of actors and the most ragtag group of priests and priestesses Avilion had ever encountered. Some shirked their white robes for more comfortable traveling attire, and more than half were fond of drink. They lingered in the strangest of places, and more often than not, stirred trouble by stealing food, antagonizing the knights, and occasionally molesting ladies at court. They turned the castle upside down, but Arthur was too busy to bother. I found it likely he gave Huifar a wide berth in order to make up for slighting her and marrying her younger sister. With the new prince, the whole castle was already upended. Until I saw Huifar in the flesh, I did not understand just how very powerful and very troubling she was. Perhaps my supposition of an alliance was ill-conceived. Huifar was not like her sister, who was all soft lines and gentleness. She was a giantess, a woman more likely to wrap her hands about the pommel of a sword than fold them in prayer. Her remarkable stature was made all the more impressive by her mane of straight red hair, nearly as red as Gawain's, and her seductive yet muscular frame. It was not common for women at court to tower over me, but even across a room, I felt diminished in her presence. Huifar did not seem to deem it necessary to wear dresses, as every proper woman did. No, she preferred leather riding pants and a loose man's shirt, over which she wore a cropped tunic. Around her neck, the only indication she had any connection to Avilion at all, hung 3 large amber drops the size of my thumbs. Amber was precious to the priestesses of Avilion. They believed the preserved sap of the ancient trees was wisdom awaiting escape. When Huifar spoke, heads turned. There was nothing demure about her, nothing sweet and innocent. In every movement there spoke the act of languid love and passion, sensuality, painful power. The day Huifar arrived, my timing was ill-fated. I informed Arthur of my intention to seek out Vivian. He did not seem to mind or question, but he asked I do one favor before departing, provided I travel with Lancelot, of course. It was Merlin who had suggested it. The gnarled old man was leaning behind Arthur at his throne, looking at me with his shrewd, unreadable eyes. The Lady Anna ought to visit Lady Huifar before she departs, he said. his voice smooth with practiced musicality. It would only be fitting, after all, since she is so close to Her Majesty the Queen. She may accept our gifts more readily when delivered at the hand of the king's sister. That is an excellent idea, Merlin, Arthur said, as bright as a sparrow. I do not think Arthur ever understood women very well, and he marveled at Merlin's insights, whether or not they were correct. I wanted to send her some welcoming gifts, gowns, furs, decorations. Did she say how long she was staying, Merlin? No indication, replied the conjurer. He was staring directly at me, as if challenging me in the silence. I did not doubt he knew about the child, of course, about Mordred. He was part of the grand scheme, but he had never spoken about it, never thanked me. And as time passed, I still heard nothing from Morgan. The last few days left me fretful. Perhaps I was misled. It felt like a strange dream. But no, I slipped my hand further down into the sleeve of my dress and felt the biting cold of the iron key to Vivian's gate. I had not fabricated it, nor was I losing my mind. I will be happy to make her as comfortable as possible, I said. Jane was attending me that day, and she shuffled behind me. Since Annette's death, I forbade her to return to the infirmary until the arrival of two of Ludoc's nieces on his wife's side, Enid and Eileen, who would be replacing her. Arthur sent me to Clothier, the seamstress, and a half-dozen other artisans in and around the castle, with Jane and Hayne in tow. By the end of our journey, half the day passed, and we were laden almost beyond our capacity. It took 4 nights to help heft the various items, including an inlaid chest Gwen commissioned for Huifar, which looked indeed as if it belonged in the circus. The Avilian ideal of beauty was far beyond me. I ordered the knights to convene at the 3rd bell so I could return to my quarters and refresh. Truth be told, I was intimidated beyond relief by this Huifar, who already challenged my concepts of courtly propriety. How strange to think she nearly married Arthur. Had he known what sort of woman he had jilted in favour of poor Gwen? I had thought not. By the look on his face, he never beheld Huifar until the moment she burst into the great hall. It made for an interesting situation. Fastening my green kirtle and letting Jane braid my hair a little more haphazardly than I would have liked, I finally emerged and met the encumbered knights on the landing before Huifar's quarters. I could already hear voices, laughter, and the clink of glasses from behind the heavy oak and iron door, and wondered what kind of ribaldry was going on. Gods alive, but there were both men and women in there. When at last someone answered the armoured knock of Sir Halloran, it was a short man with black hair and cool grey eyes, dressed as a cleric of some sort, with a wooden sword at his hip and a moon painted on his forehead. He was more than a little drunk, and upon seeing me, burst into laughter. "She's wearing green," he cackled, twirling in a drunken circle and falling straight on his rear. The crowd burst into raucous laughter, and I stood staring at the scene before me, doing my best to remain composed and project stately serenity. Huifar's room was so colourful, so garish, I found it difficult to separate the individual components making the whole. Most of the people in the room were actors and carnival folk with whom Huifar arrived, their motley garb a giveaway. A juggler arced flaming torches in the air before him. A pair of women dressed in little else but paint pawed at one another passionately, and an elaborate game of catch and kiss ran through everything else. "Hush, Jas," Huifar said, batting at the short man who greeted me and was now on the ground, clutching his stomach, desperately trying to breathe through his laughter. It took me a few more heartbeats to find my voice. The heady musk of perfume wafted through the door, mingling with the aromas of food and fruit. Huifar herself balanced a drink in her hand, the liquid a deep emerald green, but the smile on her full lips showed no indication its strength had affected her. "Huifar of Avilion, I am Anna Dulac, sister to Arthur, King of Britain. I come bearing gifts on his behalf, welcoming you to Carillon," I said, gesturing to the knights behind me, still straining under the weight of their treasures. "Oh," said Weefar, looking over my shoulder. She smirked. "Arthur sends me gifts." "Yes," I replied. "And Guinevere, of course, as well." She was close to me, near enough I could smell the sour reek of the drink on her breath. Weefar's gaze roamed over my face, then down the front of my gown. "How sad. I had thought the welcoming gift was you," Weefar continued, reaching out and tracing a hand down my cheek. I slapped it away, and Sir Halloran said, "Lady Weefar, you are addressing the sister of the king." "Yes, I am," Weefar said. Behind her, a flatulating noise rose, and the raucous crowd began cackling and gambling again in earnest. This only seemed to amuse Weefar more, and she chuckled throatily, beckoning me inside with a shake of her glass. I had no intention of entering the fray, but as there were knights behind me, both curious to see the rest of the goings-on in the room and burdened with gifts, I was swept through. My face burned with embarrassment. Who was this woman? It seemed impossible she was related to any manner to Gwen, and thank the gods she had not married Arthur. "Ah, such lovely silks," Weefar said, casually running her fingers through some of the finer examples. As she leaned over, her haphazard clothing did not to prevent anyone and everyone from seeing her ample breasts and creamy skin. One of the knights nearly stumbled over two of the catch and kissers, who, from what I could gather, were only a few breaths away from the act of love, and looked terrified as a mouse. Huifar surveyed the bounty and nodding approvingly. "Thank your brother for me, will you?" she said, as I made to the door, clutching onto Sir Halloran's elbow. "It will be put to good use." I could not escape fast enough, but when I finally did, I felt faint. I understood immediately why Merlin requested I do the job. It was the sort of business no one wanted, and as I needed something from him, he found it a fair bargain. Now that I had done Morgan's ill tidings, did Merlin find it necessary to debase me so? I entertained visions of poking his eyes out with my thumbs, but find myself calm by the time I reached the main hall once again. No worse for wear. So that is the introduction of Huifar into the canon of my story. Very different from the years that pass in between. One of the things that I wrote about in my blog today, kind of thinking about the journey that I took with these characters as I brought them into the next book, is that when you're dealing with first-person narratives, there's always stories inside the stories. And so it's a little bit of a Matryoshka doll, and how Anna sees Huifar is very important because, she misses things or accentuates things that might not always be there. And that's one of the really important things that you have to take into consideration, that first person, uh, you know, narrator is going to have their own biases. And so that's pretty essential as you grow your characters and as you have them go on their own journeys. And then I wanted to read a little bit of the introduction of Sir Gawain as well, because that is an important little section in the story as well. And that is, I believe, in chapter 2. In the beginning of the story. Just hold on for a second. One of the interesting things, of course, is the son and mother relationship. And I mentioned a few times when I first started this story, my son was a baby, tiny baby, and I remember looking at him and thinking that someday he might be tall enough to be over my head, and now he is quite literally towering over me, and it's quite the experience. And I can totally understand what Anna went through. So it's quite the story as these things happen. So let's see. I think it is just... Sorry. I should know the chapters of my own book at this point. All right. So yes, there's a lot of ends chapters. This chapter is called Dead Ends. When at the end of the chapter before this, Anna first arrives to court and finds that Gowan has decided he's going to get married, and she hasn't seen him in 5 years. And of course, she doesn't take that very well. He wants to marry this porridge-faced girl, and she's very unhappy with him. And as mothers do, she's pretty good at playing the game of mom. So in this chapter is sort of when they are able to have a conversation with each other. So this is chapter 3, Dead Ends, and it's a little bit shorter, and then that'll be it for this evening. Chapter 3, Dead Ends. "It's Gowan again," said Jane, handing me one of his notes. He had been trying to gain entrance to my apartment since I abruptly stormed out of our dinner an hour before in cold-faced horror. "He's outside the door and threatening to knock it down if you do not let him in." "Let him bellow," I said, turning away from Jane. "He always did tantrum when he didn't get his way." "Yes, your ladyship," Jane said, and I did not miss the note of exasperation in her voice. Gowan's voice bellowed all the way across the apartment, the door rattling to its hinges. I had aroused his ire. I knew him well enough that once his temper was ignited, there was little to quell it. He would find a way to destroy the beautiful front door if I let him to it long enough, regardless of the scene. That child of mine was impervious to the opinions of others, a considerable frustration when rearing him, though it would serve him, I suppose, later in life. "Fine, then. God's above and below, just let him in," I said, sitting up in bed and smoothing the furs atop my legs. My hair was combed out and fell down my shoulders, curling in gold. I twirled a lock around my thumb and watched the individual shafts catch the dim light of the oil lamp. Not entirely diminished, I hoped. After Margaz's antics, I would have to take a stern impression, and beauty was power. Jane showed Gowan in a few moments later, and he was positively seething, half sputtering words and curses and oaths before I held up a hand to silence him. "Calm down before you speak," I said, looking over at him. "I have not seen you in 5 years. I demand a moment to gather myself." He towered over the bed. Gods, but he was immense. Taller than Arthur, taller than Uther, his grandfather. There was so little of Lot in Gowan, but it was enough to enhance the diluted colours the Pendragon side granted him. His hair was dark red, red as dried blood, and his eyes gooseberry green, rimmed in blue. The high cheekbones reminded me of my own, but the round shape of the face was all Lot. It was an improvement, I think, over Arthur's own looks. Ever expressive, his brows were darker even than his hair, and thick, making it difficult for him to hide his emotions. He was still as freckled as a robin's egg, but gone with the last vestiges of youth, lost to experience and battle in the intervening years. This was a man grown. He clenched his teeth, and I saw he was missing one of his incisors, likely from a brawl, and he sported a thick scar through one eyebrow, barely missing his bright green eye. A pity. It gave him an almost brutish air. "Mother, how can you refuse me entrance? I am your son. Now you refuse me to my face, in front of my beloved." As if I needed a reminder. "I am tired," I replied, and I sounded as weary as I felt. "I have travelled a great distance, and I've numerous unsettling encounters in half the day I've been here. You'll forgive me for not wanting to be dragged into childish notions of marriage and love when I have just seen my husband at the pyre." I coughed, a little dramatically, of course, but it did the trick. His face softened, the stern line between his brows diminished. For a moment, I saw him again as the child I once adored. "I'm sorry, Mother," he said, kneeling by my bed. He looked pale, worried perhaps. "I have just been under a torrent of pressure, with your return and the tournament and Elaine." "Elaine?" I asked. "That is her name. Not Aunt Elaine, of course, but my betrothed." Would she have had any other name? Would my life be ever plagued with Elaines? Gawain, I do not wish to speak of this now. You will not like what I am going to say, I said, warning with my tone. How did he think I would approve of such a thing? He was far too young for marrying, too impetuous. Young men made bad husbands, even worse than old dotards. She's wonderful, mother, he insisted, taking my hand in his. His fingers looked like my fingers looked like a child's in contrast to his. How strange, I thought, having once cradled his tiny ones in the same way. With your blessing, we can be married at midsummer. I do not wish to speak of it. Mother, this is important to me. No, it is not, I said, taking my hand from his and sliding it under the covers. Part of me only wanted to take his head in my hands and stroke his red curls as I once had when he was so young, to tell him that love is to be cherished, and with hard work and determination, he and Elaine would have a long, happy life together. But I was not a coddling mother, and I did not want to be. I decided, with Gawain at least, fostering such ideas would lead him away from his true talents and his ambition. He could not risk such recklessness, not with his position at court, not with his proximity to Arthur. He could no more afford a pretty young wife of middling nobility than I could afford marrying Bedivere. Tell me, how did you meet this Elaine? I asked, feigning interest. If you need to tup a girl, you don't have to marry her, you know. Gawain frowned at me, confused by the question. Mother, it isn't about that. Isn't it? No, I didn't just drag her from an inn. She's been at court. Under whose attendance? Women just do not appear at court, Gawain. You know precisely what I'm after, I said. The question left Gawain flustered. He knew I wouldn't like the answer, and so I said it for him. It is Margot's, isn't it? Margot's brought her to court. Of course she did. And do you know why? Mother, it is not like that. Elaine is not Margot's. She doesn't seem to be, but Gawain, dear Gawain, you must listen to me. Margot's is a calculating woman of powers and abilities I do not think you comprehend. She delights in trouble, in trickery, and above all, playing with people's hearts. Tell me, have you ever seen Margot's perform acts of good purely for good's sake? No, it always ends in her benefit somehow. It took me ages to learn as a young woman, and now I pass that knowledge to you. He was staring at me, pain in his eyes. He knew the words I spoke were true. I began more softly now. She tried to ruin me once, and I will not see her do it to my son. I will tell you this, and heed my words. If you marry young Gawain, you give up your freedom. Your father was 50 when he first married, and nearly 60 the second time around. He was able to enjoy his family. Gawain snorted at this. There was little love between he and Lot. Death had not warmed his memories. Above all, you are a knight, Arthur's knight, and you are beholden to him above all else. What would he say to this match? His eyes moved away when I said Arthur's name. He hadn't asked for permission. I was surprised to find yet again a subject which I would have to agree with my brother. So I pressed onwards. But if the king has given you his blessing, then I suppose there's little I can do to dissuade you. Gawain flushed. I did not ask him. Not yet. I was going to. It is only... Oh, well, I'm sure he's got a very keen stance on the best knight marrying young, having a brood and being harangued to stay home and attend to his delicate wife. After all, with you off the market, everyone will be rushing to the stands to see another more favourable fight. Can't think of anyone more interesting than a married knight at tournament. He bristled, folding his arms across his chest. People come to see me fight, not to see me prance around like some sort of stallion fit for stud. I couldn't help but laugh, bitterly and long. Gawain, you are so innocent. Of course you're a stallion. You may not like it, but it is all part of the game. And a grand game it is. A game you must play to survive. You're but a part of the show in Arthur's play. As am I. We all must learn our place. Mother, enough. He rose from the bedside. I had taken the fight out of Arthur's best champion with a few words. He looked as tired as if he'd battled a dragon, which left a rather unflattering view from my end. I sighed. You love her? I think, hearing you speak of Margot's and of all her wiles, I feel like an imbecile set up to make you upset, he said. But you do not know Elaine, Mother. She is so... You can have women, I said as pointedly as I could. Don't look so stricken, Gawain. If I had the luxury to engage in dalliances in my youth, I would have. You were given a childhood, time to grow and experience nature and the freedom of your own body. Rejoice and do not seek to grow up too soon. I promise you it will be worth it. You're practically expected to have an affair or 10. You need practice. Otherwise, you'll be the talk of all the handmaidens at court, and you don't want that. Mother, Gawain, listen to me. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy the young women you want. Be careful, mind you, and be certain they'll see a midwife if needs be. But do not sell yourself short. A marriage to a woman you scarcely know. If it is her buxomness you're after, you can certainly find such features in other women who will not need ceremony to lay with you. His skin was swiftly approaching the same hue as his hair. I have embarrassed you. A little, he admitted. You'll come to appreciate my forwardness in the future, I said softly. I know it cannot be easy to have a meddling mother all of a sudden, but I will do my best. No, said Gawain, grinning a little. He looked relieved. It is good to have you here. I have felt a bit adrift, and Margot's is persuasive. She is that. For a brief moment I wondered to what levels Margot's lowered herself these days and prayed she had not tried to seduce her own nephew. I gave him a tight smile. You didn't ask about your father, I said lightly, now the air between us had calmed. There is not to ask. His ashes are cold. You're home now. Home? I suppose I am. I cannot help but wonder what he would have thought about today, though. The crown in my hands, his kingdom dissolved in a single gesture. Gawain looked out the window a moment, the filtered light, the stained glass dotting his skin with even more motley spots. I did not know what went on in his mind, but it broke my heart he had been given such a wretched father. I'm glad you gave the crown to Arthur. Caerleon is my home. Britain, my country, as it should be, Gawain said sharply. You do not desire the kingship? He looked at me with a pitying kind of expression, but sad too. I am many things, Mother, a fool sometimes it seems, but I have no kingly heart, no mind for such politics. As you said, I know my part. It is not an easy truth to accept, but one that will serve you well, I replied softly, taking his hand and squeezing it. There are worse fates than the right hand of Arthur Pendragon. He nodded somberly. I suppose you're right, Mother. I know it must be strange to have me at court now after years of freedom. I do hope we can become closer. We will, and I am glad you are here to guide me now. He leaned over and kissed my head. Well, dinner awaits. I am sure the king will send word for you again. He tried to send Bedivere with the invitation, but he reported he was not allowed in. He grinned a little, scratching the back of his head. The way Bedivere goes on about you, I swear he was half in love. The only expression I could manage was a grimace, which he took to be rather amusing. He laughed. Oh, come, Mother. And you're no longer married. You should keep your options open as well. I have no desire to marry again, even if I could pose as a willing prize, I said. Now, leave me to my ruminations. Promise to visit me before the tournament. Of course. Good night, Mother. Good night, Gawain. And that is that. So thank you for joining me for a little bit of fireside reading. I'm trying out a couple of new things out here to see if they work, and I hope you enjoyed, and I'll try to do this another time as well. Good night.